Investigative reporting is widely claimed as the backbone of journalism, and some would even argue the backbone of democracy. From famous pieces as far back as Nellie Bly uncovering the abuse of mentally ill at institutions, to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein investigating President Richard Nixon, to The Dark Alliance by Gary Webb, and more recently with pieces resurfacing with prominence, such as the Boston Globe's investigative team Spotlight. Investigative journalism has long led to reforms and accountability for people of power abusing public trust. But over the past decade, with print newspaper revenues dwindling, and staffs being slashed if not entirely wiped out, some people are concerned about the future state of investigative reporting and the home it will chisel out for itself within the digital age. In this podcast, we have Rosemary Armao, an international editor and head of the journalism program at the University at Albany, and Mary Beth Pfeiffer, who has investigated and written extensively about the criminal justice system. Both are acclaimed within the journalism community and have won several awards for the work they have done. Here at The Message with Muscavage and Murphy, we asked them to weigh in on investigative journalism and its current state, in order to gain an inside perspective from those who have practiced and witnessed the skill first-handedly change over time. Enjoy.
Rosemary Armao. She is, like I said, a professor and the head of the journalism department here at UAlbany. Connor and I have actually had her for classes, and she's also an editor at this larger project called OCCRP, which stands for Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
And they actually won the Daniel Pearl Award, when was it, 2001?
About 2 years ago.
Oh, 2011. Nice typo there, Nick. Anyways, you received a $5,000 award granted by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And could you tell us a little bit about that project and how?
Yes, about OCCRP and about the Daniel Pearl Award. This is it's the invention of a guy named Drew Sullivan, who's an American, who worked in, it's called media development, when you go into places that have never had a free press, and Bosnia is one of them. They had first a very communistic regime and then had a war and lots of poverty since, so they have never had the vibrant free press. So Drew worked there for a while and said, no, they're doing it all the wrong way. They have no tradition of investigative reporting in the United States. We've been doing it since before we even were the United States. So he set up this group where the editors were American. That's how I got into it. But the reporters are all Bosnian. So they did all the reporting, and then we showed them how to I hope we showed them how to write stories that people actually read. They don't sound like reports. And people actually got involved in it and were very interested in it. So the other thing that they've done that's real important is they realized something. There are two things. One is that no one covers organized crime and high-level corruption. Even in our country, it's very rare that you have journalists who cover that because it's hard and it's risky. You know, you're not guaranteed success. And also, it isn't sexy. People don't read read this stuff. I don't think people ever really read a lot of investigative reporting, which is why it was so nice to have big newspapers like the Boston Globe and the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. Many of those have cut back. But they would, in addition to comics and sports and sexy stories, they would put in these big investigations. Nobody now, today, types in, show me everything about corruption in my town.
Well, those are probably some of the hardest stories to work on, and that's what you just said. And
so he took this on. Drew said, well, we're going to do this. This is the most important thing in these new democracies, and we're going to take it on.
How much tougher does that make it with these language barriers working alongside these journalists that you said, they don't really have any, I guess, this AP style or any structure to news stories?
Okay, the big problem is that I can't talk to them because I don't learn languages. All the reporters I've worked with knew some English to begin with, and they took lessons and they learn it. There's just, I'm too old to learn, but they are not. And the second thing is that if you want to do international reporting, you got to know English. So they're studying it much earlier than we do. I wish that our students would take other languages, Arabic or Chinese or Spanish. We should be teaching them in our journalism schools earlier. So the second thing that Drew did complicated this language barrier because he realized, as we're beginning to see with terrorism, that the bad guys know how to use the internet and they know how to work across borders. Our cops do not, our politicians do not. We stop when we get to the border of either Mexico or Canada. The bad guys don't. So he's set up this consortium, which is what OCCRP really is, where reporters in Romania and Bosnia and Latin America and in Africa, we compare notes and we send information to each other. We work cooperatively because the bad guys are doing that, so we can follow.
You can
somebody.
see that in the OCCRP's reporting, especially in unholy alliances.
Right.
The guys are jumping around from Serbia to Montenegro to Italy to other countries along that coast.
And the one that the group won the Daniel Pearl Award on was about offshore companies. So the bad guys in one companies will set up an organization, but all the incorporation papers are in far away, Cyprus or the state of Delaware in the United States, and it's very hard to figure out who's to blame and who's responsible.
Well, I guess just to bounce off that story that we read before you came on, Margaret Sullivan's story.
Right, I read that.
And it was about the investigative reporting's future in local newspapers. And it focused a lot on Spotlight and the Boston Globe's investigative journalism team. And she claims that, investigative journalism is dying on this local level. And coming from an editor who works for OCCRP, which is a transnational organization, is that trend similar internationally?
3 years ago, I got asked by the Columbia Journalism Review. I got called for a story they were doing on the state of investigative reporting. And my answer was, I'm sitting here in Bosnia. Doesn't that explain what I think the state of it is in the United States? We, for 100 years, the best investigative reporting was done by these large papers, regional or national level papers, who could afford to set aside a team of the best reporters, i.e. the highest salaries, the legal staff to protect them, and give them time to travel and time, and they're not putting anything in the paper, and then they come out with a blockbuster. So, okay, that's gone away. You all know this. 2 out of 5 journalists are gone, as Margaret Sullivan wrote accurately. So who's doing that now? Investigative reporting is really easy to cut. People are not going to miss it right away because, as I say, it isn't high on their list. They're reading newspapers or going online for sports, celebrity news, all the stuff we emphasize. So where has investigative reporting gone? Has it gone to blogs? No.
Yeah. Well, then working off that, what is it about investigative reporting that makes you stick with it then? Why are you going to do journalism? To write cute dog stories or to write stories that are going to change and reform and improve the way we live? I got into journalism, as many people did in the 70s, because I wanted to make the world a better place. And for a long time, I thought journalism did that. Now I'm questioning that. I think if I had it to do over again, I'd go into politics. We're all shunning it, I don't want to. I'm not a crook. I'm not going to be a politician. But if I want to change the world now, I think that's probably how I would do it, or lawyering.
Yeah, so when you got into investigative journalism, what was it like back then, and what is it like now?
Well, okay, so I graduated from college the same year as the big revelations of Watergate. So here was a story where 2 very lowly reporters, beat reporters, brought down the President of the United States. And the principles of investigative reporting have always been the same. You look at how things are supposed to work. What's the system really supposed to be like? And compare that to what really happens. And in the difference, in the gap between the two, that's your story. And that's what Woodward and Bernstein did. And they showed that the President was violating the Constitution, and that campaigning had become very corrupt. And what happened after that? Well, we forget this, but Nixon was then elected with, by then, what was then the largest margin ever. So the people didn't listen, but the politicians did. And he ends up impeached and thrown out of office. That's exactly the way investigative reporting should work.
And I think Margaret Sullivan quoted this guy in her story. I think it's from Center for Investigative Journalism. I forget the man's name, but he said that a lack of investigative reporting would just allow this rampant conflict of interest and these people to abuse the system in political...
A few years ago, the Los Angeles Times won a Pulitzer Prize for an investigation of the system in Bell, California. Funny name, but it's a community near California. They used to cover that routinely. And then they stopped because, just like every other newspaper in the country, they were cutting back. So they stopped covering Bell. And in the absence of regular coverage, of reporters going to every meeting, looking at all the records, there was a system where the city officials had voted themselves raises. They had enormous raises. They were just raping the city. It was greed. It was rapacious. And so the reporters tipped to this go in and discover it. And they won a Pulitzer Prize for it. It was great reporting. However, you have to ask, was it great reporting, or was it a dereliction of duty that they hadn't been there? That reporters, sometimes you just call and ask a question, and you're reminding the politicians that, hey, I'm watching. You're being watched. Don't do this. And so, yeah, I think it's extremely frightening that investigative reporting, watchdog journalism, the reason we have a First Amendment, that's why the press is protected, is this kind of journalism. It's going away. I don't see a replacement yet.
And just to kind of go off of that, you know, we have all kinds of journalists at the state capitol, maybe not as much as we had, 10 years ago, but there's still people down there every day working in the Capitol reporting. But how do these guys, you look at the news, you see Sheldon Silver just got convicted, Dean Skelos, the Senate Majority Speaker, Silver, the Assembly Speaker. How do these guys get away with this? If they're being called, they're being asked questions. And
well, there's never a direct correlation to when a story is printed and when there's a reaction, because, as I say, the journalists are set up to just expose, to disclose, and then somebody else has to act. So there have been stories about Silver for decades. And the Times Union has really excellent investigative reporters working at the state capitol.
And he kind of just gets away with it, though.
He did get away with it, right, until now you have a prosecutor who's working. He has subpoena power, which reporters don't. Yeah. So he had one step more, and that's the system working. That doesn't happen in Bosnia and places in Eastern Europe where I work. We report the stories, we expose it. The people go, I knew that was happening. And then the officials just said, oh, well, and they go on, and the corruption and the graft continues.
Well, that's exactly what happened in Montenegro in the Unholy Alliances.
Unholy Alliances.
What was that reporter's name?
Miranda Petrucic.
Yeah, okay. Those C's are like CHs, and I have trouble saying them sometimes. But what it was the prime minister there, and he was kind of involved with this guy who wanted to build up the coast of
Montenegro. It's on the Adriatic Sea, and it's beautiful.
And there was all this weird stuff going on where he was putting up these faulty loans in the bank, and he basically wrecked the whole central banking system.
The bank was owned by him and his family. His brother and his sister were involved in it. So he used this bank as basically a piggy bank to give money. Right.
And it kind of just became like a smuggling hub for cigarettes that were bound for Italy, as tobacco. This masthead says.
Why is that cigarette trade so...
Because for years Montenegro, it was part of Serbia, and so it was under sanctions by the West, and it was being starved, and Djukanovic's, the prime minister's justification for this was, well, we had to smuggle, I had to get money into the country somehow. He's pretty open about it, and I don't think he does it anymore. However, those ties with smugglers, those connections have remained, and they continue to make a lot of money in shady ways.
Yeah, and that series is like such a good example of how this is not just one nation involved. Because there was criminals from Serbia, they were basically drug lords, and they're actually they have businesses based in Delaware, and that's kind of like a trend where I guess Delaware has low operating costs, so these guys base these like shell companies out of Delaware, and then another prime minister, a former prime minister from Thailand, came in, right? And he helped fund the bank. But so meanwhile, it's not just Montenegro, it's just happening in Montenegro. It's more of a whole issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's kind of important to train journalists all throughout these countries.
Well, it is, and I mean, in addition to losing newspapers that were a home for investigative stories, the state of print journalism has chased some of the fabulous students that might have gone into journalism. They're now looking for other careers because they don't see it as something that's viable.
They might go
that's
to
a loss.
communications.
Yeah,
stand up for some of these companies that are being charged at by newspapers.
Right, they end up being spokesmen for the companies that we used to work hard at exposing their bad deeds.
But they're dealing with some pretty dangerous people in these types of situations. You're a journalist overseas, and I guess have any of your journalists ever been locked up or captured because of the stories they write, or maybe even killed? And if that happens, how do editors such as yourself deal with that?
Oh, boy. Well, no one has been killed so far, thank God, knock on wood. But they have been threatened. We have had reporters in the consortium beaten. And I'm sure you know of the Azerbaijani reporter who has been in jail now for a year. It was her 1-year anniversary this week in jail. And she's facing 6 more years on very trumped-up charges about tax evasion. And
because she reported on the government in Azerbaijan.
She reported on the president and his family, who are incredibly corrupt. And she did it all by tracking business records around the world. They were incorporating companies in Panama. The 2 daughters of the president
and
were
the son, even he was like 12 years old or something like that.
He's
he had
also
millions
named
of dollars of real estate underneath his name. But as an editor, how do you deal with those types of situations? And I guess even more further than that, as a human, how do you feel?
Yeah, and as an American, I always feel nervous giving advice about this because there have not been deaths of reporters in the United States to the extent that they have them overseas. Yes, there have been some, but and there have been deaths here, but they're usually journalists of a certain ethnicity who are writing for the ethnic press here, and they are in danger. But, American journalists getting killed, it doesn't happen. So, yeah, I'm in Bosnia or Serbia, and we teach no story is as important as your life. But there's a real desire. I very much admire these people who feel this need to put their lives on the line. They do take risks because they think it's worth it. And Khadija in Azerbaijan is one of those people. She knew she was being targeted by the government because her stories were very hard-hitting. There had been threats before that. They put cameras in her house and took pictures of her with her boyfriend and then publicized the pictures. This is a Muslim country. You can imagine the grief that might have caused her. It was all an attempt to make her shut up.
But how about her spirit throughout all of this?
She's amazing. She's just
7 years,
really amazing.
That's
That's what
she said.
Yeah. That's the sentence. We'll see what happens. But after they expose her like this, she goes on Facebook and social media and goes, okay, this is what they did. Here's the pictures. I'm still going to write the stories. So that she knew she was targeted. She could have worked in Georgia, the former Soviet state. She could have come to the United States. She chose to stay there because she thinks that freedom is worth losing something for. You make some sacrifices for it.
That's a similar sentiment of those 2 journalists that you brought to University at Albany. They're actually involved with OCCRP too, right? One was from Azerbaijan,
right,
and the other one was from Ukraine.
No, they actually are not involved with OCCRP. They were involved with other media who operate in those places.
The Azerbaijani
Radio for Europe, right?
Yeah, she was involved with that.
Yeah, and so she knew Khadija too because she's a national star, a journalist as a star. Maybe Spotlight will do that.
I actually don't, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, I don't have them with me. I'm terrible. I don't remember my children's names without looking them up.
But you know what's funny with that? It's we had like this little open-ended discussion with them with our journalism class of American students and these 2 reporters who really weren't that much older than us. They were in their 20s, I think.
Right. And one was 30.
Yeah, they were just asking each other, what one of the main questions was, what's like one of the main what's one of the hardest things you guys have to deal with as Americans? And some of the answers that our class put up, I was kind of like grimacing because I was like, ooh, do you know what these people have actually went through? Like they're talking about how we have like too much homework, so we can't go out on weekends and go drink. We can't drink as much as we want to drink because we have to study for our school that we're able to go to without any threat of the government.
Yeah, and then the journalists from Azerbaijan later showed us a video of, I think, police breaking up like protests over there and just being really brutal with the population over there.
Absolutely.
So I mean, we've been talking a lot about mostly Eastern European countries, but you actually did go abroad. I think it was a couple years ago to Algeria. Do you see,
that was also through OCCRP.
Yeah.
I worked on a project. They had a grant to work in Algeria.
Is that like how different, is that a different experience, like working in an African country? How is it?
This is an Arab country, not African as in sub. I've worked in Uganda too, but this was different. I didn't like it because they have a horrible problem with terrorism there, and specifically they target foreigners who are working in the United States. So you're really restricted. You get a hint of what it's like. We couldn't give our address out where we were staying. We always had to use drivers, and we were working with an Arabic newspaper. Now that was really eye-opening. At the end of it, one woman came up to me and said, I've never liked Americans until I met you. Now I got to think differently. So, they have never been exposed to Americans before. And the other thing was that it's incredibly sexist. There are whole topics that can't be covered at all. You don't write about homosexuality or women's rights. Even entertainment, you have to be careful how you write it. Yeah. Some stories like, I just wanted a feature story. It wasn't investigative, on neighborhoods where minarets are set up in Algeria. And there's bright lights and music 5 times a day. There's a call to prayer. And it wakes up people. You have spotlights in the middle of your bedroom. They wouldn't do the story because they did not want to, possibly offend the imam, the church. So they have all different problems than we did. And so just by being there and talking to the men reporters, the same way we are as equals, that was eye-opening. There were women everywhere in the newsroom, but not in the bosses' chairs. So that was also an amazing experience.
And that's a similar sentiment, just to backtrack to Spotlight. They didn't want to do harm to the Catholic Church because so many people were devout Catholics. So that's a weird thing that religion comes down to that, where it almost trumps ethics.
Well, religion and government too. After 9/11, I think for the most part, the media in this country failed its readers and viewers. We thought it was unpatriotic to question weapons of mass destruction. Really, where are they? How do you know? Are you sure? And there were very few outlets that did this. Those that did write those stories were criticized, and their stories were not run. Or if they were run, they were deep inside the paper, past all the pages about shock and awe, and this is great. Let's yay America. That's not doing our job.
Looks what ended up happening.
Yeah, it's the whole quagmire in the Middle East now.
Just to work off of that, do you think that's like a part of a larger part of the American psyche, like how Stephen Colbert likes to call it truthiness, where it's not based on facts, it comes from the gut? Do you think that's that?
It's an interesting thing. If you look at a lot of stories, as I have over the years, you see that there are frames, ideas that the facts kind of fit into. You're seeing it with the terrorist couple out of San Bernardino. Yeah. They were a seemingly normal couple. They had a lovely child. Nothing was amiss. People are shocked. Well, that's baloney. No, they weren't. Why did they have that baby? We don't know that. And he was growing a beard and had stopped all of his usual procedures. He was obviously being radicalized if anybody looked at it. But we don't want to see that because it's a better story that there was this instant conversion by powerful ISIS.
What did you think about I think it was MSNBC and CNN letting people letting reporters into their homes? What do you think about that?
It was the landlord that let them.
Oh yeah, it was the landlord.
I think it was fine. If it were me, I would have gone. I said this on WAMC today. I would have gone right to the guy's sock drawer to find out what was there. Yeah. The FBI cleared it. It would not have happened if the FBI did not clear it as a crime scene. Now, whether they should or not, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office has a criticism of that. But as far as the reporters were concerned, they said, you can go look. Wouldn't you go look? The terrorist nest? What is immoral about that? What's so bad? I don't think they should have shown pictures of the baby. And Andrea Mitchell, who is an experienced journalist, yelled at the reporters who were doing that and said, let's not do that. And she apologized for it later. Yeah. But no, to go in, absolutely, I would have gone in. I'd mark you down if you didn't go in and you had the opportunity.
I'm just going to hop back to OCCRP and just mention, you guys did the Yanukovych leaks. You guys won an award for that, too, I'm pretty sure.
These were the Ukrainian journalists who did that. They were affiliated with us. What OCCRP really did, it was Ukrainian journalists did the hard work here, but they provided the website and the support and money and all of that to get it online. That's a great story, yeah.
OCCRP, most of their stories have their own interactive websites, like dedicated to the series, and the articles are all listed on these websites individually. And I guess... I want to ask, how long does it typically take to produce this content, report, and create this website? Because in the case of the Yanukovych leaks, it was in a matter of days, and it was being updated as it went on.
They did that
really
one
nice
quickly.
looking websites. They're not just, they're not clunky, they're not clinky. Maybe they used to be back in the day, but they're really shaped up.
Well, you know how I said there is no new home for investigative reporting since the demise of big city newspapers. Well, this is one of the organizations that is looking for that new home, and it might be in documenting their websites and the sort of technological wonders that we're seeing in coming out of journalism today. So they have always worked on their websites and kind of interactive tricks to get people involved in stories, all kinds of visualization. Some they don't all succeed. It's very experimental, but that's what we have to do.
Yeah, and I think it is really effective too because, like what you said, these crimes don't stop just in a country. They don't stop just online.
Nope.
And a lot of people don't follow along with that, but you have this website that now is dedicated to this. It's not just the news organization's website. It's, this is always going to be a reminder that this happened.
Right.
And it's set away on this special place. And I guess just to switch gears again, I don't know why I keep saying that, but your sister is, she works at the Washington Post, and I don't know if this is a result because of the lack of funding that is now afflicting investigative journalism, but I read this story that her name's Joanne
Armao. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
She's the associate director of the editorial page.
And she's also kind of like this de facto investigative journalist now, is what this story said in the Washingtonian.
She works in the editorial department and does her own investigations. A lot of editorial writers simply take reporting done by others, either in their paper or elsewhere, and writes on that. But Joanne has always gone beyond that.
Yeah, so they kind of describe her as the judge, jury, and executioner because she's able to do this investigative piece. She works around the city, which is kind of like a metro beat, and then she also does these opinion pieces. Mm-hmm. And do you think she has this hat that she wears of all three of these because there's not as many people to work in this investigation?
No, I think she's always had that. She used to be the AME, Associate Managing Editor for Local. So she has a deep knowledge, long experience of the area. It's the same thing you were talking about Spotlight, that here's somebody who knows when the pattern's not right, when somebody's doing something wrong, and she just keeps after it until she can uncover it. She's done that as an editor, as a reporter, and now as an editorial writer.
And I guess before you go watch Spotlight, because you're going to go see that tonight,
I'm
right?
going to see it, yes.
I guess just one more question to wrap it up. What's going on with OCCRP now? I know you probably can't get into like too many specifics, but what's on the plate for you guys, and what do you guys plan on doing in the future?
They're working on several documentaries right now, and 2 more investigations that I know of, but we don't talk about it before they come out.
You really can't.
Yeah.
How many documentaries have they made before? I don't know if they've done that.
What they've done is worked on stories in print and then turned them into documentaries, and that's a little backward. As they've gotten better at it, they're now going to go right to documentaries. So,
do you know any off the top of your head that they've done that with? 'Cause I would be interested.
They've done some on tobacco smuggling. Was done as a documentary. That's the one I know the best. Yeah.
Connor, do you have any last questions you might want to ask?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, do you think you missed anything with the OCCRP? Or
I hope that we give a sense in here of how important investigative reporting is. I hate hearing, every reporter is an investigator. It's just not true. Yeah. Many are just stenographers who record something that happened. And I read that stuff too. I like that. But true investigative reporting is deep and explanatory and illuminating journalism. And we need it. And I worry about a country that distrusts reporters and has stopped reading and viewing news. And that's your generation, too. How come I teach investigative reporting here. I get very few students who sign up. And I'll say, okay, tell me the last investigative story you read. And I remember one young man raised his hand and said, Watergate? I go, how old were you in 1972? So, they've read about it, but they don't do it. That worries me.
That was Rosemary Armao, an international investigative editor and head of the journalism program at the University at Albany. Up next, we have Mary Beth Pfeiffer, a longtime investigative reporter at the Poughkeepsie Journal and nationally syndicated writer who has studied, investigated, and wrote dozens of stories and later a book on the United States criminal justice system and the treatment of prisoners, specifically ones afflicted with mental illnesses, within it. Here she is.
All right,
Thanks for calling in.
Thank you for having me.
So, we're just reading from your bio right now, straight from your website, crazyinamerica.com, and I like the part where it says that you were reporting on this rarely explored and little reported reality of prison life, and that's suicides, and it was mainly of, a lot of times it was of these mentally ill prisoners. Do you want to explain a little bit about your 3-part series and the work you've done since then involving this?
Certainly. I have covered conditions in New York State prisons in particular, but also nationwide in my book, pertaining to mentally ill prisoners and what happens to them once they get into prison. Just to back up a little bit, though, people who are mentally ill sometimes end up in prison because they build up records of offenses, very petty offenses often, and they sort of climb this ladder, rung by rung, of minor, inconsequential acts of shoplifting or trespassing, that sort of thing, that really grow out of the fact that they're mentally ill. And they may do something like walk in somebody's apartment, and that's a real case that I'm aware of someone who went to prison, who thought he knew the person in this particular apartment, was arrested, and ended up on a burglary charge in a New York State prison. And there he, like many people, did very poorly because of his particular mental illness. People who are mentally ill don't do well in prisons because they're highly controlled, highly regimented environments.
Well, one of the sorry to interrupt. One of the big things about these stories is this idea of the solitary confinement, as you call it, as it's called in a lot of pop culture, the box.
Right.
What is it about this that just in general, mentally ill, like confinement in America, what is it about these hidden tragedies, as you call them, that kind of drew you in to write about them?
Well, because I had come across a database of people who died in prison. And there were 4 major categories of death, but I focused in on suicides. I wanted to know about the people who committed suicide in prison and why they committed suicide. And I found 2 things that really startled me. One, that many of the people who committed suicide in prison did so in solitary confinement, which is the worst aspect, the worst kind of housing in prison. It's the place where people go who are considered the worst of the worst. But what I also found out among these people who committed suicide in prison, that they did it in solitary confinement, but that they were also mentally ill.
Yeah.
Very often they were mentally ill because they could not cope with the rules and regulations of prison, and they were often given what are called tickets. They were punished in prison because of their behavior, and their behavior was often related to being mentally ill.
Yeah, which involves like almost outbursts or different forms of acting out that they really couldn't control, is what you mentioned, and they would get punished for it, like you said, and stuck in these solitary confinement cells, which are very cramped spaces, and they would be there for sometimes years at a time. And I think it was because they weren't really being treated, from what I've read through articles, for their illnesses the way that they should have been treated for. And instead they were just thrown in like these little tiny boxes, from what you call them. And I guess I'm sorry.
It's a horrific reality. I mean, just think about staying in a bathroom. That's probably the size of what one of these cells
with
is.
no human interaction.
A regular household bathroom, but you can't get out. But the problems of being mentally ill still stay with you when you're in a prison, whether you're medicated or not. And following the rules becomes a very big problem. There's a lot of stress in prison. So then maybe you're relegated to your cell because you've broken a rule. This is sort of one of the steps towards solitary confinement. You may just simply be kept in your cell and not allowed out. And that may lead to, as you said, other behaviors that are self-destructive. And self-harm is one of them. There's cutting that goes on. There's refusal to eat. There's other ways in which inmates will act out.
Mm-hmm.
There have been, just awful examples of inmates who were kept in solitary confinement or just kept to their cells for long periods of time, who have hurt themselves in a variety of ways. It's kind of a downward spiral, and it's really not something we want to be doing to human beings. And as I was starting to say, there have been some improvements in the prison system regarding people with mental illness, and in particular those who go to solitary confinement. For example, they have to come out for 3 hours a day as opposed to 1 hour a day in general. And every 30 days they have to be analyzed by a mental health professional to see how they're tolerating this kind of brutal treatment. But the long and short is we should use it very, very sparingly for a very small number of prisoners, and we do it far too often for far too many.
Yeah, and in your 2006 article, I think it's from 2006, from the New York Times, Cruel and Unusual Punishment, you mentioned you pretty much gave a recommendation to the state, or you did give a recommendation to the state, that the New York legislature should move to prohibit the placement of people with serious mental illness in isolated confinement. And do you think they've gone far enough, or at least the New York State government has gone far enough with this recommendation that you've given?
No, I certainly don't think so.
Well, what do you think? What do you think is next?
Well, we need in our society to have a much broader discussion about incarceration generally. We have far too many people in prison in America. We have something like 6 million people, I think is the last number I read, who are either in prison, in jail, on parole, or on probation.
Wow.
We have more people in prison per capita than any of the major industrialized countries in the world. There's a problem there. We have many, many people of color. They're far overrepresented in prison. We have many people still in prison for drug crime, for which they would do better if they were given drug treatment or job training. We could save this country a great deal of money if we imprisoned far fewer people and instead tried to help people to deal with some of the issues that land them at the doorstep of the criminal justice system. So I think that's really where we need to start. And if we did that, if we greatly downsized our prison system, if we incarcerated fewer people, we certainly would incarcerate fewer mentally ill people.
Yeah.
They're a share of, and a pretty large share. I mean, we're talking anywhere from 16% to maybe, I've seen numbers as high as about a third of the prison population is mentally ill.
Wow.
So if we just, overall started looking at the idea that we need to incarcerate fewer people, close down some of our prisons, we'd really do a lot better.
Solitary confinement is typically a punishment that exists as a further form of discipline to incarceration, meant to reform a prisoner to act more appropriately for society. But what if law enforcement officials, the judiciary, and policymakers began thinking of other forms of rehabilitation? We asked Mary Beth Pfeiffer about the LEAD program in Seattle, which stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. It's a pilot program in the city with an aim to keep low-level drug offenders out of prisons by directing them to social services instead of a prison when caught committing a crime. According to the prison reform advocacy group, the November Coalition, nonviolent drug offenders with no prior criminal history make up around 16% of the federal prison population. The Seattle program has garnered positive feedback and even piqued the interest of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who has sent a team to Seattle to find out more info on the pilot program.
That sounds very progressive, and it is in line with some other programs that I've heard around the country. In New York, we have drug courts, which basically serve a very similar purpose. They try and keep people out of prison by connecting them with all of the resources that we might have in social service agencies and drug treatment agencies. They basically say, we're going to take a different look and a different approach with this particular offender because we think this person might work well if we go through a drug court rather than a traditional court, if we look to deal with the root problem rather than immediately just kind of, throwing the key away. But the problem also with those programs is that the resources out in the community that we connect people like this to are short on staff and short on money and not able to, give the aggressive kind of treatment. And, Nick, one of the reasons why is because we are spending so much money on prisons and so many thousands of dollars to keep people locked up. Lockups are so much more expensive than care in the community.
Talking about investigative journalism at large and the investigative process, because we mentioned before in this show, movie Spotlight, and the type of blowback that those journalists have gotten from covering certain stories. Have you found any instances where it's been tough to cover a story because of other parties involved? And specifically, I guess, your stories on the mentally ill and solitary confinement. Have you seen, perhaps any prison officials or people who work, in the Department of Correctional Services or even politicians give you blowback on some of these things that you're writing? And if so, how did you deal with it?
That comes with the territory. Investigative reporting carries a lot of responsibility, and it's a rather stressful career. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work. You have to ask people for information they don't want to give you. You have to be on them a lot and, keep calling, keep emailing, keep writing, follow up on the Freedom of Information requests that you filed that they pretend they never got or that they, ignore. It's not an easy career, but that's not really what I worry about or what bothers me today in 2015 when I think about investigative reporting. What bothers me is that newspapers and journalism in general are really struggling in this economic milieu. There have been incredible cutbacks in newspaper staff, incredible drops in newspaper advertising. And when I say newspapers, I'm talking about the media in general. We are moving to more of a digital model, but a lot of investigative reporting begins with that print product, which is also digital, but which survives on the print revenue. Print revenues have traditionally held up
print
our
advertisements.
Newspapers, right, and our investigative teams and our investigative reporting. And just, one statistic I'll throw out there, newspapers brought in about $50 billion in ad revenues in 2006. Last year they brought in about $20 billion.
Wow.
That is an enormous drop.
Yeah,
and
more
as
than
a result
half.
of, way more. And as a result of that, you have seen a lot of cutbacks in newspaper staff, not just investigative reporting, but in newspaper reporting generally. So I'm quite concerned about the future of investigative reporting because we have seen many, many people leave the profession, many, many people laid off. And that's a problem for America in terms of keeping, institutions and government honest.
Yeah. And going off of that, since print is kind of slowly dwindling, like you said, do you think the rise of the digital age has a chance of promoting and helping increase investigative journalism? Or do you think it's going to continue to hinder it by taking away from print profits?
Well, that's a great question. And, that's the question like every journalist and every editor in particular in America is asking. And on the one hand, the digital product enables us to reach people all over the place and all over the world, and has really increased our power, if you will, to make a difference. For example, I've written a series of articles about Lyme disease since 2012, and it has gained me followers in Australia and in Europe and in all over the United States, because Lyme disease is a huge problem, and people are looking for answers. And the fact that I can put my articles online means I can reach people everywhere. And as a result of that, at least in part, New York State passed a law last year to basically improve protections for doctors who treat for Lyme disease in an untraditional way. I won't go into all the details, but in the past, and this is part of my investigation, many doctors were being prosecuted or persecuted under disciplinary guidelines for treating Lyme disease in certain ways that weren't accepted by the mainstream. Anyway, I wrote a lot about that. I got a lot of coverage. We, our editorial page at Muscavage Journal, wrote about this problem and really campaigned for change in the law, and that happened. So that's part of the upbeat part of
it's almost like a global connectivity.
Yeah, and it's been great. The digital age is really great for news in general. There are many, many different news outlets out there now that we didn't have before. Many ways that investigations are being undertaken. The ProPublica is one, all digital site that has broken huge stories, and there are a number of those kinds of outlets. But as far as being economically viable, that's really the question.
Yeah, it's just that.
Because, a lot of this new age investigative reporting that's being done, for example, by ProPublica, is being financed by foundations. ProPublica is nonprofit. A lot of them are struggling to stay afloat.
Yeah, and just
at the same time, just one other point: while newspapers have very lively and prosperous, so to speak, digital presences, web pages, those web pages do not bring in the same kind of revenue as the print product, and they really haven't filled the void left in the shortfall of circulation to the print product.
And just to keep this, to bring it back to New York and kind of localize this investigative reporting special that we're doing here, are you familiar with Danny Hakam's Used and Abused series that was in the New York Times?
I certainly am.
Yeah.
I wrote a related series to that.
Yeah, and which series was that from you? That's is that the Crazy in America series? Is that what it was going by?
No. This was about, this is probably the biggest story, quote unquote, based on money that I have broken. And what I revealed in a series of articles from 2010 to about 2012 was that New York State was charging the federal government about $5,000 per person per day at its developmental centers.
Wow.
For people with Down syndrome and autism and so forth. And these are institutions that were supposed to have been closed years ago. Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo, had promised that they would all be closed by the year 2000. That didn't happen. So I looked into what the problem was there. And long and short, and there were congressional hearings, by the way, held on this as a result of the stories that I wrote when I was reporting for the Journal. They found that New York State had overbilled the federal Medicaid system by something on the order of $16 billion.
Wow.
Over about a 20-year period.
And since then, did you see anything really change in the last couple of years?
Yes. That system under which the state was able to overcharge the federal government has totally been overhauled. The Medicaid formula has been changed, and moreover, institutions that relied on these monies to stay open are being and have been closed. And the reason that's good is because institutions for the developmentally disabled were known many years ago to be places that were inhumane in many cases, where abuses occurred, that were not the ideal place for people with developmental disabilities. That it's better to put them out in the community in small homes, called group homes in particular. And that series of articles more or less got that process back on track.
Yeah, okay. And just to switch gears real quick, I see that from your Twitter profile that you've been working on a biography of Seymour Hersh. He's the famed investigative journalist.
Actually, not me.
Oh, really?
My husband, Rob Moraldi,
okay,
who is an author and a professor, now retired at the State University at New Paltz, authored a biography which is out.
Oh, okay.
Called Scoop Artist, which is about Seymour Hersh, probably America's #1 most widely known investigative reporter.
Yeah, and I just want to ask
breaking stories since the 1960s, and it's terrific.
Yeah, he's a famed investigative reporter. But what do you think about his most recent article on the killing of Osama bin Laden? And it was published in the London Review of Books as opposed to the New Yorker. Do you think it's a sacrifice that he kind of took to get his story out there? Because do you have any comments on that?
Well, yes, but how informed my comment is I'm going to just leave it to the listeners to decide. But I've read a number of articles about his article. I've certainly talked to my husband, who is an expert on Seymour Hersh, and that is a very controversial article. It didn't appear in the New Yorker because I've read that the New Yorker didn't feel it was well sourced enough.
Yeah.
But I think what I can say from having followed Hersh's career for years is that he usually gets it right. He has been in the position before of being sort of the outsider, of writing pieces that weren't initially accepted, but were accepted years later. And he, for example, broke the story about the CIA in the early 1970s, basically conducting surveillance of American citizens, opening mail, that sort of thing. And when that came out, it was very controversial, and a lot of people said that couldn't happen. That, Hersh is wrong. Well, they held congressional hearings, and it turned out that Hersh was right. And unfortunately, those hearings occurred after the Pulitzer decisions were made. He probably would have won a Pulitzer Prize if that had come out sooner, if people had accepted what he said, but needed the test of time.
Yeah, and maybe just to wrap it up, a more general question about the state of investigative journalism and the importance of it. Why do you think investigative journalism is so important to people and democracy? And also, off of that, what kind of advice would you offer for anybody looking to go into journalism and actually maybe wanting to pursue investigative journalism?
Well, first, it's so very necessary. Investigative reporters hold government accountable. They also hold, the private sector accountable as well, but more often it's government. And investigative reporters get angry when they see injustice. They want to fix things. They want to contribute to that, often very slow process of reform, but a process that I have seen work over my 30 years as an investigative reporter. And I think we're taken for granted. I think people don't realize how important we are to a democracy because we are so used to having a press, a free press. We take for granted that we can get to the truth through our media, and that government cannot stop that process. So yeah, I think the investigative reporting is really, really important.
That was Mary Beth Pfeiffer, an investigative reporter. We would like to thank her, as well as Rosemary Armao, for joining us this week on the Message podcast, and we hope you would look up their work and read more about what they do. This podcast would not be possible, or at least would not sound nearly as good, without our musical friends. The intro song of this podcast is called Real Talk by Pandemonium or PDM Beats, and the link to his website can be found in the description below. The outro song of this podcast is called Corridors of Time by Marsh Sound, our de facto executive music director of the Message podcast. We hope that you will check out more episodes of the podcast of The Message with Muscavage and Murphy, or perhaps tune into our radio show that airs every Monday night from 6 to 8 p.m. on WCDB Albany 90.9 FM. Thanks for tuning in this week.